Lewis and Clark, second edition, the latest in my irregular series of games that made me go, huh? And it is, for the first time, a Euro game with no combat whatsoever, but plenty of decisions. Hi there, my name is Neil, and this is Diagonal Move, a channel that looks at board games. And today, I'm going to look at Lewis and Clark second edition. I'm going to give you an overview of how the game works, some examples of how the turns work, and also offer some thoughts on why it's such a interesting game, why I think it's such a good game. However, why also I think it can also be quite an unforgiving game, particularly when you're new to it. The game is set in the early 1800s in the America, or the newly formed America. And the Louisiana Purchase has not long happened, and an expedition was sent from the existing United States across the hitherto not very well explored northwest region of the States. And that expedition took several years to happen and was eventually successful. And in the game, you are, as players playing that expedition, you are competing expeditions in the multiplayer game, and you're competing against a solo timer, essentially, if you play the game solo. Now, the reason the game is in this series, which features games which are typically quite innovative, or they're quite challenging, or they had something in them that tripped me up a little bit, is because of these cards. These cards are the driving force behind your game. It's a game that features hand management. Lewis and Clark also features worker placement. There is resource management, but ultimately it's a race. And the key to the game is being as efficient as possible with how you manage your cards, how you manage the workers, how you look after your resources and expend certain resources at certain times in order to be first in that race. It's an efficiency puzzle, really. It's what it is. And if you do well and you manage to look after your resources and you manage to play the resources efficiently, play your cards efficiently, use your workers efficiently, then you're going to do quite well. However, if you trip up, you're going to struggle, really, really struggle. And there is an element of this game, particularly the first time you play it, and to be honest, it's been in every single game of this I've played in the last year or two, where you sit looking at your cards and you think to yourself, what am I going to do? There are so many choices and so many options, and each option that you do will not only use the option that you take, but you'll also remove another option because you need to play a card, pay a card to play a card. And as you get more and more of these cards come out in the game, there's a stack of cards. Each card does something differently. Each choice that you make both opens up new choices and removes other choices. And if you do it wrong, or you are not as efficient, shall we say, as you could be, then the game can be quite challenging to do. Having said that, it's also it's just a brilliant game. There are so many different things to keep an eye on, so many things to consider, and if you like heavy games, then this is a game to consider. The only other game that I've played that really makes you take a hand of cards and sit and stare at all the possible options and try and work out the permutations was Mage Knight. And Mage Knight is a very, very different game in every other respect, but that feeling of what do I do with what I've got is such an enthralling puzzle in this game. And the other reason I really like this game is it's not a typical Euro game that has a theme pasted on. The theme of the game is very much rooted in the history, and every single one of these characters that you come across in every single card is also a character from history, people who were involved in some way in the exploration of the northern parts of what is now the United States and Canada. And that richness of the theme really adds to the game, it adds to the puzzle, knowing that this is a representation of what actually happened, and people who were on this expedition had to manage their resources in this way. Admittedly, it's abstracted in this game, but it's a genuine puzzle that had to be solved, and you're recreating that puzzle. There are perhaps, as we look at it with more modern eyes, certain design choices that you may perhaps consider whether or not that's wise in today's kind of way of looking at things. This is a game that was originally released about 10 years ago, I think, and so maybe that's something to think about. But the game as a whole is wonderful. It's really good, but it is tough, and you can trip yourself up quite nicely, or quite badly even. Okay, with all that said, let's take a look at the game. I will go through the mechanics, give a few examples of play, hopefully give you enough of an idea for you to know whether this is the sort of game that you would enjoy as much as I do. Was hoping to do a full solo playthrough, but I tried it 3 times and I failed miserably. I forgot to turn the camera on, the battery ran out, and then when I did finally film it, it was best part of 2 hours long, and most of it was spent with me doing this. And no one wants to watch 2 hours of me doing that, and I really don't want to edit it, so narrow view of the game compared to what was intended, but hopefully it will be enough for you to get a sense of how the game works. Thanks very much for joining me so far, if you're still with me, and I'll take you over to the game now. Please do think about clicking those like, subscribe buttons and all the other ways you can support the channel, and in the meantime, let's take a look at Lewis and Clark.
Here is the board for Lewis and Clark set up for the solo player. This is what the game looks like at the start of the game, and I will show you how the first round plays out, and also what the differences are between the solo game and the multiplayer game as we get to them. The solo game, in terms of player actions, is identical to the multiplayer version, with just one exception. So bear that in mind as we go through. The aim of the game is to take your expedition, which is represented by this meeple here, this what's called the Scout, from St. Louis all the way up the river to the mountains. You then have to cross the mountains, navigate some more river, cross some more mountains, and then finally camp at Fort Clatsop on the Pacific Northwest coast. Easier said than done. The reason it's easier said than done to get your Scout up the river and over the mountains to the Pacific Northwest is because you need to do it quicker than the other players. In a multiplayer game, that would simply be your opponents. In the solo game, you would have a timer that would move 1 space each time you do your action. In order to move your expedition, you need to manipulate resources and take actions on the board. Your expedition, in addition to the Scout, has this player board here, and on the player board we have spaces for resources and for local helpers from the native tribes that you'll encounter along the way as you traverse the American wilderness as it was during the time when this was set. The way to manipulate resources and to ensure your Scout figure moves is dependent on cards, and there's a few different cards that we have. I'll go through them a little bit in turn, but the way to move is with the captain or the leader of your expedition. While the different players would have different historical figures on their cards, the cards at the beginning of the game are identical. So everyone will have one of these cards with the same movement options on them. When you play this card, you have to take a food resource or a boat, which is the blue one, in order to move on the river. Now, gaining food is relatively straightforward because you can play actions and take a resource gathering action in order to gain food. Boats are a little bit more tricky because you have to convert resources in order to get the boat, which in this case is two wood, and you convert it to a boat. And then when you have the required resources, you can play this card for one of the three actions. Now, food will let you move on the water, boats will let you move on the river. Horses at the bottom there are slightly different. They are the means by which you have to cross the mountains, and the process for getting the horses is similar to that of getting boats, in that you have to get certain resources and exchange them for the horse. But in this case, it's 3 non-identical resources to get a horse. And so when you have a nice momentum going and you're traversing the water 6 or 7 spaces at a time, you'll suddenly find yourself in a position where you're at the mountains, and those boats and the food will not get you across the mountains, and your strategy either needs to change completely, or more realistically, you need to have thought of a way of getting horses before you reach the mountains. The way to manipulate resources is complicated somewhat further by this card here. And this card is the interpreter, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to enlist the help of the local tribespeople, and these are represented by these meeples here. When you have recruited some of your local tribespeople, you place them on your board, and then as your action, instead of playing a character card, you can do one of two things with them. You can place them on the board for an action. So for example there, I could gain 2 wood or 2 fur. Here I could transfer 3 wood into one of these additional boat spaces or expedition tiles. However, as you go through the game, you're going to find yourself with lots of different resources all over your board, and possibly a selection of workers as well. And when you run out of things to do, and by that I mean you have no more cards to play, or you can no longer place a worker, you have to look at the board to see how many resources and how many workers you have left on your board, and then calculate the additional time it will take you to transport those resources and workers on your expedition. This space here with the 2 blue and the white, that would be 1 amount of time that it would take. This space here is 1 amount of time per resource, so in this case it's going to be 5. I think that's 5. You can transport 1 local for free. That doesn't cost you any time because they're a very helpful worker. This space here, however, is 1 additional time per worker you have remaining. And so if we ended our turn, we had to do what was going as camp at this point, we would have 1, 6, 7, 8 time in order that it's taken us to do that camping action. And what that means is that when you play your boats and your horses and your food with your captain card or your commander card, you have to first take the movement actions required to remove the time, And so if you have 8 resources, you're looking at 2 boats, 4 horses, 4 food, just to get rid of the time. And then once you have got rid of the time, then you can begin to move your worker. And what you end up with as a result of that is quite a challenging efficiency puzzle, where you want to finish your turn with as few resources as possible, with as few helpers remaining as possible, and with no cards in hand as possible, or with as few cards in hand as possible, because if you have cards left in hand, any additional card in hand when you finish your turn would also be an additional time per card. There are some subtleties into how you interplay the cards and the workers. On the card here, and I'll just stick with the captain card to start with, which is this card here. You can do either or one of those actions. Each action you perform has to be given a certain strength value. It has to be powered up, if you like. And the way you do that is by taking another card. For example, and I'll stick with the interpreter card just for now, you could power up this card with the interpreter, reversing it, and then the number of tribespeople, basically a number of 2, that's how many times you can take the action. So in this instance, the first worker would let me take one of these actions, and the second worker would let me take one of those actions again. You can also add to that with your workers, and in this instance play that card 3 times, or do the 3 actions on that card. If you have no cards to spend but you have workers, you can power up using purely workers. When you do that, however, and you camp, and I'll just leave the card there for now just to show, you do bring those workers back into your boat, which could potentially cost you time. Workers, however, that are played on here are no longer yours. They have gone back to their tribe. In hand at the start of the game are a number of other cards, and they all do more or less the same thing. They allow you to collect those primary resources. We have equipment in grey, fur in yellow, wood as the brown, and then food as the pink buffalo. The way this would work in a multiplayer game is you would play the card, powered up by another card, and then you'd look to your other players to see how many of the symbol for the resource you want to collect is visible on both the power card and the card being played. So for example, you may have 1 symbol, that's 1 resource you can gather. Your opponents may have 3 or 4 symbols between them, which means for the 1 time that you've powered it up, you can take up to the number of resources visible on the icons. Should you have 2 power attached to that card, you could take up to 5 resources and then take up to 5 resources again, or whatever the number is of that symbol showing, but you could never take more than the number. So if you want 5 but there's only 4 showing, you're limited to 4 from any one of those actions. In the solo game, this is slightly different. The principles apply in that you have to power a card up, but you need to review what's on the board. And what we have here on the board at the moment, I've just placed some of those workers on the board, and we have the symbols that match the symbols on those resource gathering cards on the board. And when you play this card powered up, you can also not only take what's on your card, but also any matching symbols where there is a worker. So here, for example, this card we just played would have 1 symbol on the card one symbol for this worker as well, so we could take up to 2 resources per strength level that we power up that equipment card. We couldn't take this because it's fur, it's not the right equipment, and we couldn't take this one because there's no worker there. That is the major difference between the solo game and the multiplayer game. Now, when you start the game, you have 6 cards in hand, and everyone has basically the same 6 cards. 4 resource cards, a captain that lets you move, and an interpreter that lets you recruit people on the board. I've mentioned briefly that you may, when you run out of cards or you run out of workers, or at a time when you choose to do so, you may camp, which means you take stock of the equipment you've got, you take stock of the characters you've got and the helpers you've got, and work out how much time you are faced with as almost as a penalty. And that camping action is free. So on your turn, you will always do either play a card or place a worker. In addition, you can camp should you choose to. The second free action that you can do at any point on your turn, so before you play a card, after you place a worker, after you camp, is take a card from the display. And at the start of the game, the display is blank, and the first thing you do in each game is take 5 cards and then place them according to their strength, which is the number of Indians on the back there, onto the board. Drew too many. And obviously then you reveal them. The cards that are on here are people who you can employ to help you on your expedition, and they are typically allowing you to do something that is better than the cards in hand. For example, this card is more powerful, can charge up cards for a greater strength value, and you can do either or food and fur gathering. This card here is valued at 3 in terms of strength for powering up the cards, and can do fur, food or wood. This card here will allow you to pay equipment to gain a horse, thereby negating the need to find 3 separate non-identical resources to pay for a horse to get across those mountains. However, these characters come at a cost, whereas the tribespeople will help you out of the kindness of their heart. These characters will come at a cost, and that cost varies depending on their strength value, which is the number there, and their position on the track. So if I try and zoom in a little bit, this card here will cost you 3 equipment plus 2 fur. The card underneath it will cost you 2 equipment and 1 fur. When you buy or you recruit your card, you pay the resources and you take the card directly into your hand, and then these things slide down, meaning that cards are now cheaper. So this card here costs 3 equipment and 1 fur, whereas before it cost 2 fur and 3 equipment. And over a period of time, what you'll end up with is a hand full of cards that you can use to manipulate those resources in a different way. And so while everybody started with much the same opportunity, as you progress, you'll have to come up with a way of managing all these cards, because at some point you're going to reach a stage where you cannot use cards, you're going to incur more and more time penalty, and you are going to find that a large hand is a problem. Fortunately, on the board you have certain actions that allow you to negate some of those challenges around large numbers of resources, large number of cards. This action here will allow you to discard from hand and then completely clear that character display. This action here, again, these are all worker actions, if you like. You'll pay 3 resources and claim one of these expedition tiles, which allow you to store extra resources for free or hire an extra local tribesperson without any cost to time. In addition, if there's a card that you particularly like the look of, but your opponent has taken it, you can use this action here, which is the shamanism action, to do any one action that's face up, either in your display or in somebody else's display, for free, but only to the value of 1 strength, regardless of what happened before, in terms, well, as in what power it was charged up to before. And over the course of time, you're going to spend time playing cards, using workers, and moving your pieces across the board, eventually arriving at Fort Clatsop. Now, the winner is not necessarily the first past the post. As you move along, you have to camp with a number of time less than that stated on the board. So if you finish here where it says, where there's a symbol for 2, you would have to have less than 2 time after you've camped. If you have 3 time, a game does not end, affording somebody behind you a chance to catch up and finish the game before you, even though you are further ahead, because of the amount of time it may have taken you to get there. In a moment, I'll show you how the first few rounds of the game plays, just to give you a sense of how all this fits together. Let's take a look at how all of these different moving parts fit together in Lewis and Clark. What I'll do is I will play through a few turns, maybe to the first time that we camp, possibly a little bit further, just to give you a flavour of how everything fits together. As I mentioned in the introduction, I did try to do a full playthrough, didn't go too well, so we're just going to do a few turns to just to give you a feel for how this all fits together. Playing the solo mode, as I mentioned, the only real difference is that we gain resources from these tokens, not from other players, and we need to move the Alexander Mackenzie meeple 1 space at the end of each of our turns. Should Alexander Mackenzie get all the way over here before we do, the game will win and we will be second. Okay, first thing we need to do then is to draw and order character cards based on their strength on the back. This is the first time we do any reorganization of these cards in the game, and it's really the only time you reorder them based on their strength. Normally they come out as they come out. So we have here 2 3 value, 1 2 value, and 2 1 value. And so we'll just put them as they come out onto the relevant spaces, like so. In future, when cards are removed from this track, we simply slide things down. We don't do any reorganization. And our first turn then, we need to look at what we have in hand. We have some movement, we have the movement, the means to recruit or enlist the help of the local people, and then resource gathering cards. We have 1 worker which we can do to use, or which we can use to gather resources, and then we have the option of buying some of these character cards. Currently, there's only 1 that we can afford. We start the game with 1 fur, 1 equipment, and 1 food. The character cards on display at the moment cost 1 food and 1 equipment, 1 fur, sorry, and 1 equipment, and then they start increasing. 1 equipment, 2 fur, 2 equipment, 3 fur, 3 equipment, 4, 3 equipment, 5, and so on. So we can only really afford to buy the first one, and the first one here allows you to discard 3 or pay 3 fur, which are the yellow hexes, to gain a horse. that would be really helpful if we have a means to generate fur and we are looking for the mountains. No, maybe not necessarily that helpful at this point. And really what it's doing is it allows you to use one resource rather than multiple resources to get those horses, which are all important for moving across the mountains. But in the early part of the game, the mountains are all the way over here, and so we need to cross the river first. Also on here we have this character here, John Booley, who allows you to pay wood to remove some time, very helpful. And then we have a few that allow you to move along the river, pay a food to move 3 river spaces, use a worker to move a certain amount of spaces based on something that's on the board. I'd have to look in the reference to see exactly what that one does. It's currently unaffordable. And then finally, 1 of each type of resource to move 7 on the water. That would be really helpful because you can move a long way on the water with that, and we only really need to have 1 more resource to do this. Unfortunately, it's very expensive at 3 equipment and 5 fur, so that's something for later unless we can find a way of getting more resources. As I mentioned though, unfortunately the only thing that we have available or what we can afford to purchase is this one here, which is the least helpful at this point in time currently. So what we should probably think about doing is gaining some resources. There's a few ways of doing it. We can play a card powered up by another card or a worker, and then gain the resources shown, plus normally any of the food icon on display in your opponent's play areas. However, for the solo game, it would be based on workers in the relevant spots where the food icon is. So at the moment, we would only get 1 resource for doing that, which is perhaps not the most useful thing. So let's first use our worker to go to this spot here, which allows us to take either 2 fur or 2 wood. Wood would be useful for building boats, fur would be useful for gaining characters, and I think I would like to get some of those better characters. So I'm going to take 2 wood. I have the option to camp now, which is where we do some accounting on how we're doing in terms of our equipment and so on, and that we have on our player board, plus a count of how many characters we have in hand, plus how many workers we have on the boats here. And doing that at this time would leave us with a tremendous penalty for unspent character cards, so we don't really want to do that. The other free action is to buy one of these cards. We can only buy that one, but really I would like to get this one here, which allows us to pay a food to move 3 spaces. I don't have enough equipment. I do have enough fur now, but not enough equipment. So what we really need to do is to gain some equipment. A couple of ways of doing that. One is to use the character card. One is to gain or enlist the help of local people. Either way has its positives and negatives. And I think what I'll do is I will use my interpreter to enlist the help of the local people. I will use the fur, I'll use the fur card to power that action up, because we've just got enough fur now to do what I really want to do in this turn. And so I'll play the cards into my player board, which I appreciate you can't see down there, so I'll place them there. And I've now powered the interpreter with 1 strength. And what the interpreter lets you do is recruit people. Or I'm not sure the exact terminology in the rulebook off the top of my head, but you take workers that are on the board, place them in the middle, and then choose how many you wish to bring into your expedition to help you. And I'll take both. One will have to go here because there's only space for one. The others will need to go here. And what we want to do is to try and finish our turn, or our sequence of turns, with only this one remaining here, because the others all cost time. And I've just realised I've done what I did in the earlier playthrough attempts, which is forget to do the Alexander Mackenzie action. So we moved one for the fur, and we now need to move one again for the interpreter action. And the final part of the interpreter action is to just slide down the card on the lowermost, cheapest space, pop it into the discards, and then slide all these others down as well, meaning that that card that I'm interested in is now somewhat cheaper. And we just reveal the last card, which is another resource gathering card. Okay. Alexander Mackenzie, the purple meeple, is moving further up the track each time we do anything. So let's think about now how we can get a character that allows us to move a little bit more along the water. And I'm going to use my worker in order to do that, to get the extra equipment needed. I have one equipment, but I need two in order to buy the character. So I will use not one of my cards, but my worker, because this worker will be placed on the board and then will have gone back home, and meaning that at the end of the game, or the end of the sequence when I camp, I won't have to pay any time. So I'll place there, gaining me, in this instance, one equipment and one wood, which I pop here. If we were to camp now, that would be a challenge because we would have one time here and one time per resource on here. So managing this element of the game is very important. Fortunately, you can move them around as much as you see fit during the course of the game for free. So we just need to move Alexander Mackenzie, and now it's our next turn. And at the start of my turn, you can do this at the end or at the start of your turn. At some point in your turn, you can recruit one of these recruitable characters, and I will pay my 2 fur and my 2 equipment in order to get Hawk's Feather, who will allow us, for the cost of 1 food per strength, move 3 spaces up the river. And that card goes straight into hand. I'll also take the opportunity to remove or move some of these these equipment items along, so I don't forget to do it later. And then we will just move Alexander again as he moves further along the track. At this point, I feel like we should really begin to do that movement. However, I am thinking also of the need to gain some food, so perhaps we can do this action multiple times. And so we now have all the equipment we need, but some food would be helpful. So I'll pay for the food gathering action or character with the wood character. I'll play that into my player display, and allows me to take one food for each of those tokens there on display, or those icons. Just the one in my player area. We do not have a worker in either space, so we just take the 1 food onto our board. That's the end of my actions that I want to do, and I've just realised we haven't revealed a character. Okay. So let's do that then. Let us move using this card here, and we will do that with a combination of our equipment card and our remaining worker to move or perform that action twice. Again, you probably can't see that. We're starting to run out of space here. And I will then take 2 food and move 6 spaces up the track, 1 per strength that I've activated the card for. So which will leave me 1, 2, 3, 4. We jump over the opponent, 5 and then 6. That's the end of my turn. I do have 1 card remaining, no means to power it up, so at this point I may as well camp. And that is a process which involves looking at how many locals you have remaining in your your expedition troop, placing that back on the display in an available spot. Looking at the total resources you have on your board, currently I only have these two, so there's no time penalty for that, no time penalty for that, but I do have the one unplayed card, which means I take a time penalty for that unplayed card. The final part of the camping action is to take your played cards back into your hand and begin your next turn, remembering to move Alexander if you're playing the solo game. And so that is a sequence that we need to use. Now, in terms of what I've got here, and one of the reasons this game can be quite punishing is I really don't have very much here that will allow me to move across the mountains, because the mountains is moving with a horse, or it is having a character card that you would need to buy to move across the mountains, a little bit like this one does with water. But we don't have any of those, so we need to come up now with a way of generating resources while generating food that will allow us to move and yet not incur all these penalties. We can have a go at doing that just for the purposes of the demonstration, and we need 3 non-identical resources to get a horse. We could make an attempt at getting a new character. I've just realised when you do the interpreter action there should be a new meeple appear there, so that you have an evolving number of meeples available to you throughout the game. So how then would we get the resources to have there? I think the first thing I'll do, and I'll show you how the resource gathering works for the solo game. Let's say I wish to gain an equipment, and I'll do that paying the one character to power up the equipment. I'll just do that. Actually, I'll do that with the addition of the local helper, meaning this card is now powered up for 2. So I can take 1 resource for that symbol, and I can now take 1 resource for that symbol. So I can take 2 resources times the 2 for the fact that the card is powered up by 2, meaning I can take up to 4 equipment. And I'm just going to take all 4 because they're really helpful for buying characters and for combining to get a horse. Now that does leave me with an interesting situation here, because I now have no workers in which to do that action. So let's have a look at what's available on the character cards to see how we go forward. Wow, this is a challenge, but I think what I'll do is I will now spend for free, as the final part of my turn, I will spend 1 equipment and 1 fur even to get this character here that lets me pay wood to discard time. And we'll slide down those characters. And again, we have another water card on the board, so we need to really think about horses more than anything. Finally, Alexander does need to move in the solo game, and he jumps over us in the same way that we jump over him. And continuing with our food-based strategy, I think what we really could probably do with here is using perhaps fur to get some food, which will give us just the 1 food resource. And we'll move Alexander. And then I think what we'll do is we will use the captain here to pay for the ability to move 3 using that food we just gathered. Okay, it's just there. Alexander moves, and then probably our final turn of this particular set of actions we're going to use the interpreter to discard that time from before. We have it powered up at a strength of 2 automatically because of the value of the card. However, we only have 1 wood, so we can only do the action once, and that action would be to pay the wood to remove the time from our board. And we can do a little bit of equipment shuffling, and we're now at the point where we need to camp because we have no further actions to do. We don't have any more locals available, run out of character cards, calculate the time, no time for anybody on the board, no character cards left in hand, and so at this particular point we are okay, we don't have to spend any more time. And so Alexander moves on once more. Okay, I think that's where I'll stop. I think that will have given you, or at least I hope that will have given you an idea of how the game plays, how you have to balance what you do with cards in your hand with what you do with the helpers, and how you manage new cards coming into your hand, and the changing requirements for moving along the river, whether that's through boats, through characters, and then also getting hold of horses or other characters that allow you to move on the mountains. And just as an example, I will see if I can find an example. Yeah, here we go. For example, this character on here, if and when it comes out, would be paying equipment to gain a horse. Much better than having to pay three to move a horse. Here you'd have to pay 2 wood to move on a mountain, a worker and a resource to move 2 spaces on the mountains. Okay, I will call it a stop there. Otherwise we could go on for an hour looking at how the game all fits together. Hopefully that's helped. Please do click like, subscribe if you haven't already, comment as you feel you'd like to. I do try and answer comments that I get. But that then is Lewis and Clark 2nd edition, and I'll see you next time.